Good morning. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm a Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy and Director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. Thank you for joining us for this webinar toward a resilient higher education system. 650 people have signed up for this session, demonstrating the urgency of the questions we'll be discussing today. This conversation forms part of a series on perspectives and pathways in a time of crisis that has been developed by the Royal Irish Academy. Recordings of previous sessions on virology, on economic issues, and on social justice are available on the Academy's website. On October 2nd, to give you an advance notice, the series will continue with a session on lessons from history, where we will be joined by Dr. Michael Ryan of the WHO, historian Dr. Ida Milne, and the historical demographer Professor Sven Erik Mamelund. Details will be on the Academy website. Our chair today is Lorna Fitzpatrick. Lorna is president of the Union of Students in Ireland. She represents in that capacity 374,000 students. She was previously president of the Students' Union at IT Carlow, where she took her degree in business and human resources management. Lorna, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan, for that introduction. I think this webinar is taking place at a really poignant time. There has been a lot of discussion over the past few weeks and days about the safe return to campus, how our sector is prepared, and how we ensure those within our communities are protected during that time. There has been a lot of work undertaken by the sector to get us to this point. The shift to emergency online learning in March came as somewhat of a shock to us all, but now we are, or at least should be, in a space where we are more prepared for the return to learning. We know what the return will be different to previous years. We've had guidelines and implementation plans prepared, and they are being rolled out across campuses. And I do think there are still many challenges facing us as a country, which will of course impact us as a sector. However, we are committed to the safe return to learning on campuses, which, without meaning to sound naive, I think is half the battle. I think the importance of partnership between students and staff, institutions and government is vital. We have achieved a lot over the past few months in terms of planning, but implementation, review, and necessary changes when needed will only happen smoothly and effectively for all involved when partnership is at the core. I think we'll have a very fruitful discussion today, but before I introduce our panel, I would like to take a moment to thank everybody who has put an awful lot of work into planning this event. I would like to take a moment to thank everyone who has been involved, to the RIA for hosting this discussion, to THEA, the IUA, HECA, TUI, FORSA, and my own organisation in USI for bringing this event together today. And finally, I'd like to thank Deloitte for their generous support and sponsorship for this event, who have aided in making this a truly inclusive and accessible webinar. We have a very interesting panel with us today who will share their thoughts with us on the safe return to campuses across the country. At any one time, you should be able to see one of our panellists and one of our sign language interpreters on screen. My aim is to have time for discussion and some questions following our contributions. So please do send your questions into the chat function and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So on our panel today, we have Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, Simon Harris. Minister Harris previously served as Minister for Health from May 2016 to June 2020 and as Minister of State at the Department of Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform and Taoiseach, with special responsibility for the OPW, Public Procurement and International Banking from 2014 to 2016. The Minister's involvement in politics began after he established an autism support and lobby group in County Wicklow to seek to give a voice to people living with autism and their families to articulate their concerns and needs. He works tirelessly as a disability advocate, and through his work in the disability area, he has first-handed meaningful understanding of the issues affecting people with disabilities. We are also joined today by Professor Pete Lunn, who is the founder and head of Behavioural Research Unit at the ESRI. His primary area of research is how people make decisions that affect their financial, environmental and health outcomes. At the beginning of the present pandemic, Pete was appointed to the Behavioural Change subgroup of NPHET. His team have conducted multiple behavioural studies over the past 6 months designed to improve public communication about the virus to support compliance with public health guidance. And our final guest today is Professor Philip Nolan, who earned his degree in physiology and medicine in 1988 and 1991, and a PhD for his research on the control of breathing and the cardiovascular system during sleep, all from the University College Dublin. He joined the staff of UCD in 1996, and in 2004 he became Registrar and Deputy President at UCD. In August 2011, Professor Nolan was appointed President of Maynooth University. Early in his tenure, he established a new strategy for the university in its research, teaching and engagement activities. He initiated a university-wide review to reimagine the university's undergraduate curriculum, and this new curriculum was launched in 2015. Many of the changes, which range from broader entry routes and language study to increased course flexibility and discipline combinations. They are considered sector leading among higher education institutions. He has played a leading role in reforming the transition from second to third level, in widening participation in higher education and in promoting equality and diversity. The Maynooth University Strategic Plan 2018 to 2020 emphasises further enhancement of research capacity, significant development of the postgraduate portfolio, comprehensive internationalisation and equality, diversity and inclusion. He was appointed in 2017 by Minister Mary Mitchell-O'Connor to the National Gender Equality Task Force for Higher Education, which reported in 2018. He is leading a national review of specialist cardiac services at the request of the Minister for Health, the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, and he chairs the eHealth Ireland Committee and is currently chair of COVID-19 Irish Epidemiology Modelling Group, Advisory Group, which reports to NPHET. So I'm going to go in reverse order of the introductions, and I'm going to hand over to Professor Nolan, first of all, to share your perspective of an educational leader working within the public health advice. So I'll hand over to you, Professor Nolan.
Thanks very much, Lorna, and apologies for providing you with too long a biography. Certainly the Maynooth University Strategic Plan 2018 to 2022 did not anticipate a global pandemic, so we've had to adjust. So if people can hear me clearly, just maybe two forms of perspective that I'd like to offer, and I'll stick to the 8 minutes provided. The first is a perspective, as you say, as an educational leader, and the second is the perspective that I've been privileged to have through involvement with NPHET and government in terms of advising on the very difficult policy decisions that government have to make. I think what's been really impressive throughout this has been the extraordinary efforts of colleagues. Lorna alluded to it already in terms of the very rapid emergency, as she put it, shift of all of our educational activity online within a matter of days back in March. Very quickly thereafter, exceptional efforts right across our sectors to support students who are either marginalised, perhaps through lack of resources or difficulties with access to broadband, or because their learning style is somewhat alienated by that shift. I think we really need to be conscious that colleagues really do bear in mind all of the time that different learning models are better suited or less well suited to different categories and types of student. So a huge amount of work went on with the support of government, I have to say, to support students who are somehow less well positioned to adapt to that emergency shift to online learning. The third really impressive thing about the response of the sector, and by the response of the sector I mean its staff and students, was the recognition that this coming academic year was going to be different. We're going to have to adapt. And right through the summer, not only were colleagues working to adapt, but faced this huge uncertainty about what was safe and what was unsafe, what was the scenario likely to be. And I don't think we thought we would be where we are right now with resurgent disease in Dublin and to a certain extent across the rest of the country. So it's very difficult to plan for a coming academic year when there's that extraordinary level of novelty and uncertainty and urgency in the planning. And I think colleagues have really done an extraordinary job And then not only have they demonstrated that resilience, but they've demonstrated the flexibility that when the public health situation changes and we're required to do less on campus than we might have anticipated. And I know that's been exhausting for colleagues in our sector, as in many other parts of the public service. Colleagues don't have the resources they would like to have to do that, again, notwithstanding recent very significant investments from government, and people really have been extraordinary, and that reflects a much wider kind of courage and commitment right across Irish society, which has us where we are right now, not where we'd like to be, but certainly in a much better position than we could have been. I think it's also important to acknowledge as a leader just the extent at the same time to which we're tired, frayed, frustrated, constantly having to deal with challenges and new challenges and sometimes unanticipated challenges. Just from a public health perspective, one of the things that I'm kind of fortunate to be in a position to understand, I think, is what is safe and what's not safe. So maybe just a couple of perspectives that I'm really looking forward to the discussion and dealing with questions, but just some perspectives. And the reality is that this disease will be with us for at least another 12 months. So we'll have a vaccine sooner or later. That vaccine will be deployed in an organized manner very quickly or quickly, but certainly we're going to be living with public health interventions to control the spread of the virus, in my view, for at least another 12 months. The prevalence of the disease will rise and fall. We may have regional surges as we're having now. The second thing to note is right now we're seeing about 10 new cases per 100,000 people per day in 19 to 24-year-olds. So that's 1 in every 10,000 people per day. So that means in a university like Maynooth, with 10,000 students, we're going to see a case a day in our campus community, at least when our campus community reconvenes, largely virtually, but in some cases physically in the coming weeks. We can expect to see small outbreaks in student houses and on-campus student accommodation, just as we're seeing in family homes right now. And I really do want to resonate with Lorna's point about partnership with students. The way to limit the number of cases among students, the way to limit spread among students is for students themselves to understand how to learn safely, how to live safely, how to socialize safely. And they're not going to hear that message from somebody like me. They're going to hear that message from their own student leaders. So that partnership is essential. I don't think we're going to see much transmission in the classroom. I think we're going to see transmission in social events and social congregation outside the classroom. I'd be surprised if we see much or any transmission from students to staff. And that's because, irrespective of what you might hear in media or social media, this virus really does transmit. It requires prolonged close contact. It doesn't hang in the air. And I know some academic colleagues firmly believe that it's transmitted over long distances by aerosol, and I understand why they think that, but I don't agree with them. It really is when you're sitting on the couch beside your partner watching television for a couple of hours in your home. It's when you get together with friends, like in the old days, in a crowded pub, and you're right in on top of each other. It's when you eat together. So when we see transmission on campus, it's not going to be because of some event in the classroom. It's going to be because people sat down and had lunch together and weren't careful enough in having that lunch. So I'm going to stop now. I can expand on those things. So I'm going to be teaching in the second semester. I normally give 12 lectures. What I hope to do is put those 12 lectures online, divide my 300 students up into 6 groups of 50, and see each group twice in my 12 lecture slots. I think that's going to be safe. I'll feel safe in that environment, even though I'm in an at-risk group due to asthma, because I can keep 2 meters distance from those students. And I'll feel even safer if the partnership with our students' unions work so that students have understood and internalized and made their own the safe practices, living, socializing and learning that will keep them safe on campus. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions or even disagreements on those points.
Thank you very much, Professor Nolan. I have to say I very much agree with your points about the different learning styles for students and ensuring that all students have access to high quality and engaging learning. And of course, the difficulty in planning with such uncertainty. And I agree there is very much a role for partnership here to limit the spread, I suppose, but I think clear communication is a key element of that. So we'll now move on to Professor Lunn, who will share his perspective through the behavioural science lens with us today. So I'll hand over to you, Professor Lunn.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I want to take the first 20 seconds of my 7 minutes to say thank you to Philip. I think it is so difficult to do live science and modelling in the kind of public glare that you are doing it in. And I want to say, I suspect on behalf of very many people listening to this, thank you very much for how hard you are working and how well you are working, and all power to your arm. That said, I'm also going to pick something up that you've said, because I think there's an awful lot that as a behavioural scientist I want to unpack. And that was about the importance of students understanding how to live and learn safely. Yeah, I think that is extremely important, but as a behavioural scientist, it's so much more than understanding. Understanding is a vital route to behaviour, but behaviour is influenced by very many quite complex factors. And one of the tricky things, I think, with this pandemic from word go has been for us to identify what are the primary factors that are going to drive people's behaviour that influences the likelihood of infection. Now, I should stress to everyone here, I'm a behavioural scientist. I'm not medically trained. I'm not trained in public health. I know very little about the transmission of this virus other than what I've picked up from listening to people like Philip over the last 6 months. But what I would say is there are things I know about the behaviour that people undertake in circumstances like this. And I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is about the degree to which that behaviour is not individual but collective and how important that is to understand. The second point is about how important it is to make behaviour that you're requesting and requiring from people as easy for them as possible. And the third point I'm going to make very briefly is about well-being. So to do that, to start with the collective, it's very easy to have a model in your head of how people behave during this crisis, including students as they come back to campus, which says that they're doing a kind of internal cost-benefit analysis about the behavior that they might be about to conduct, which says, look, is this risky? And, could I catch the disease from this versus, can I be bothered? What's the benefit to me of going ahead and doing something, even if it's a little bit risky, and some kind of internal cost-benefit analysis. That little kind of model of how people behave is only really partially true. We know overwhelmingly in this crisis that it is a collective action problem and that the public understand it as such. In other words, the motivations that people have, and this includes the large majority of young people too, is actually about the risk to others, not to them. The thing that worries them most about this crisis is actually playing their part in transmitting this disease to loved ones, to family, to friends, to lots of people, being the link in the chain. They're not particularly scared of the disease itself. What they're really scared of is being the person who gives it to others and plays a poor role in that, and particularly might be seen to do that they might let down the group that they are the groups that they are members of in some way, whether that's their families or their friend group, or their student group or whatever it happens to be. People instinctively understand, and we know this from multiple studies and data, that they are in a collective problem where all of our behavior and our outcomes depends on the behavior and outcomes of the others around us. And what that means is that their behavior is very strongly socially determined. It isn't just about what they understand and some kind of cost-benefit analysis. It's about the norms that they see around them. if they see that everybody else is contributing to a common aim and they understand clearly what that common aim is, they are much more likely themselves then to contribute to that common aim. So wherever we can put in place rules, practices, guidance that is unambiguous and simple and highly visible, compliance is much, much more likely. Safe behavior is much more likely because people don't want to be seen to be the person that's violating the good norm. They don't want to feel the shame of that, to have the people looking at them, to experience the social disapproval. Their behavior is very strongly socially determined. And what that means is that in the language that we use and in the environments we create, we're having a very big impact on the kind of behavior that people engage in. Mild social disapproval is really important, but setting in place environments where behavior is, as I say, visible and unambiguous whether people are complying is extremely important. So just to give a very simple example of that, you know, if instead of placing hand sanitizers on walls by doorways and just one of them, there's actually 3 bottles on a table and you actively have to walk around the table when entering into a room, far, far more people use the sanitizer. It's exactly the same decision, but what you've done is you've changed the environment. So you've signaled very, very clearly what the social norm is, that it's expected in that environment. And non-compliance with that norm, which requires people to actually walk around the table, is highly visible. So you've made it unambiguous and you've made it visible and you've made it far more likely that people will comply. And that's what the behavioral studies show. The other thing you've done that's really important there, and this brings me on to my second point. So that first point is it is a collective and social thing, and we are setting the social framework. One thing I really should say, and that actually before I move on that I've forgotten to say, is this. If we highlight non-compliance, if we highlight bad behavior with people behaving in ways that we don't consider safe, it is really, really important that we don't make those sound like norms, that we start by thanking the people who are complying and the large majority of people who are doing it right before we pick up the people who are not. So back to the sanitation example. A crucial element of that is also that you are making the behavior really, really easy for people. The easier you make it for people to behave in the way that you want to, so as they come back to classrooms, if all classrooms have multiple sanitizers in places where you have to walk around them, if it is the case that where we have got face-to-face teaching, the first thing that is the norm that is in place in that room is at the start of the lecture just says to everybody, can I just check that everybody has sanitized their hands before coming in here? Please don't be embarrassed if you haven't, just go and do it now. If we put in place those kind of norms and we reinforce those norms and we encourage everybody to behave as a collective team to engage in those kind of behaviors, we are far more likely to see high levels of compliance. In a way, I want to use the analogy here for making it easy of software engineers, because I think people might understand this a little. We've all battled, as people who work in higher education or in education, we've all battled with software that drives us mad because we can't work out how to do things, and we know somewhere deep down the software can happen. For a software engineer, if somebody's going to the manual, they're losing. You know, if your user is going to the manual, as an engineer, you're losing. Exactly the same is true of setting up behavioral environments. We don't want people to have to go online to look at the government list of 24 behaviors that are or are not allowed. What we want is them, when they are entering an environment, when they're in an environment, for it to be intuitively obvious what it is that they need to do. So the best software is software where you have a problem, even if you've never had that problem before, you think the software has functionality, you can just find it because there's an obvious button that's giving you the right idea. Behavior is exactly the same. We need to set our universities and colleges up in ways where good behavior is clear and easy and obvious and reinforced by the environment and the norms that are around people. Okay, so I've got a final point to make, and my final point to make is about well-being, and I think this is very short but very important. The data are absolutely clear about this. The people who've taken the biggest psychological hit in Irish society, and it's a really big hit, are young people. We've all taken a hit. On average, the well-being hit to Irish society is the equivalent of us all having been made simultaneously unemployed. It's huge. And it has recovered somewhat since the early days, but it's still pretty poor, and it's worst among young people. That means that there is a much bigger responsibility, I think, on us to support young people at this time than there has been in previous years. And one of the ways we can do that, there are many ways we can do that, and all of the wellbeing services and the psychological services that are offered by institutions are really important, more than ever during this coming term and year. But I think the other thing is that one of the things we learn from the behavioural research here is that getting people to focus not on what they can't do, but on what they can do is really important. If I was a young person going to college, I would be feeling incredibly unlucky and disappointed that I happen to be, college is supposed to be some of the greatest years of your life, and I happen to be in the year that gets this random bullet that affects my time. It's very easy to focus on the loss and the disappointment, and what we've got to get people to do is focus not on what they can't do, but on what they can do, and to encourage and enthuse them to do what they can do. Young people's well-being is going to be really, really important over the next year or so, and we can do a lot to reinforce it. So that's my contribution. I hope that's reasonably interesting. I look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Lunn. I have to say I very much resonate with your contributions in relation to the collective behaviour and creating and encouraging those new social norms. And I think supporting young people is going to be vitally important, and you've addressed that so clearly. But being mindful of how we communicate what we can do this year is something for us all to reflect on, I think. So thank you very much. And finally, we'll move to Minister Harris to share your perspective, I suppose, on the return to learning and maybe from the policy side as well. So I'll hand over now to Minister Harris.
Thank you so much, Lorna and colleagues, and thank you to everybody who's logged into this webinar today. It clearly shows a massive interest, but also a very proactive and engaged community wanting to do right by the sector, right by those who work in the sector, and right by those who learn in the sector. So I really want to thank all of you who worked so hard to put together today's event. I must say I found the last two presentations fascinating, and I think Professor Lunn has made a point that I've been trying to articulate, but maybe have failed in recent days in relation to, we're talking an awful lot about restrictions. And that's important, and it's important that everybody knows how we need to alter our behaviour. But for the well-being of all of us, and because we are all human and social creatures, I do think it's so important that we do focus on how we can live our lives safely, what we can do safely. And I really welcome, I was furiously taking notes in relation to some of your suggestions as to how we not just explain, but also discuss and talk through the various things that we can do. And I think that piece of behavioural science is going to be key as we try to bring people with us. Everybody in this country wants to do what is right by their family, right by their community, right by their country. But we have to help them, and we have to help them understand what is required. And we have an absolute responsibility to be clear and crisp in our communications, for messaging not to be confused, and to put effort into making sure that there's a logic and a rationale behind what we're asking people to do. I too want to take a moment to really thank Professor Philip Nolan, and not just as a former health minister who was lucky enough to have you chair our modelling group for NPHET, not just as a member of the government, but as a citizen of this country. I am extraordinarily proud of the work that you've done. I really believe it's patriotic what you're doing, taking very complex things that none of us, certainly I, hadn't a clue of only a few months ago and didn't wish to, but we've all had to become familiar. If you remember that ad about, I don't know what a tracker mortgage is that used to play back in the day. Now I think everybody's had to learn about modelling and the OR number and the likes, and you have taken us through that journey as a country in a humane way. Even in recent days when there was a debate about how you pick up COVID in the community and how it gets into your home, and a view that it was nothing to do with restaurants or social settings. Again, you explained it, and you explained it using a variety of forums, not just appearing on Morning Ireland, but also taking to social media. So I really want to thank you for that. I remember at the start of this pandemic, Dr. Tony Houlihan, our Chief Medical Officer, said to me, communications in a pandemic is absolutely key. In politics or policy making, it's often important, but it's absolutely key, because we don't have a vaccine currently for this virus. We don't really have effective treatments. We're seeing the case numbers going in the right way, in the wrong way. So the resource that we have is clear communications on how we try and live alongside this. And Philip, you've been exemplary in that, and I really want to thank you. And I was delighted when I moved from one department to the other that you obviously still remain in a leadership position in my new department and sector. Really pleased to have an opportunity to speak at today's event. I think it's absolutely timely, and it's great to see such interest and such collaboration. I've had an opportunity, from looking through the participants list, to meet with many of you either in person or virtually over the last 10 or 11 weeks since my appointment, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to engage with the rest of you in the coming weeks. I won't dwell on it today, but I do see the establishment of this new Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science as a real opportunity to herald a new era in terms of focusing and providing an attention and a level of detail that perhaps we haven't been able to focus on further and higher education in the past. We've had many good ministers for education, many good people working in the Department of Education, but they've so many other issues to compete with: pupil-teacher ratios, schools, teachers, very important issues. But there's a lot of important issues in our sector as well, because we have to believe in lifelong learning. We have to believe in everybody having the opportunity to reach their full potential. And having a dedicated cabinet minister, a dedicated department, I hope gives us a new opportunity in that regard. And I'm genuinely excited to be able to provide that focus and attention. And with that will come increased scrutiny as well. I want to begin today by thanking everybody in the sector. And that is my principal message today, to say thank you. Thank you to students, thank you to staff, thank you to department officials, because we all know further and higher education didn't stop in March. It just switched. It switched to new and, as Lorna says, emergency ways of delivering. And the good thing and the encouraging thing, despite the difficulties that I'll get into in a moment, was that the QQI report that came out very recently showed that despite that switch, so much work and leadership was provided, the standard of education held up. So and that wasn't always inevitable. And that is thanks to a huge amount of work. So thank you to each and every one of you who, in very tough times for our country, for the sector, for you personally, a time we're all worrying about our health and well-being, for stepping up and providing so much leadership to make sure that further and higher education continue to be provided, albeit in a different way. I think we're going to hear an awful lot about the word partnership. I think I've heard everybody say partnership so far, and that's not by accident, because this is key. There isn't a magic lever that I have here in the department that I can pull to make sure that there's a safe return to further and higher education on my own, nor does anybody on this call. But when we all come together and work together and collaborate, we can make things happen. And we've seen that partnership exist from, let's call it, March to September. And I think we're now entering another phase, a new phase of the partnership, which in my own mind takes us from now, the start of the new academic year, to the end of the first semester. And I think that's probably a manageable amount of time. We know this virus will be with us for longer than that, but I think it's right and proper that we now focus on the return to college, the new academic year, and trying to get to the safe conclusion of the first semester. I think it's fair to say this year's academic year has probably been one of the most anticipated and most challenging in the history of higher education in the state. We have decided that education is a priority in our roadmap. So as we're trying to limit social contacts in other settings, we're doing so to create a safe space to allow people to have a degree of social contact in the education setting, because we know education isn't just transactional. You can do a lot over a webcam, but education is more than just transactional. It is about coming together, but doing so in a safe way. And in that regard, so many people have put their shoulders to the wheel: staff, students, management, government, agencies, institutions, representative bodies, to ensure that students can return to college. And I do really use that term in the broadest possible sense. I want to say this though: education is a priority, but the number one priority as we steer our way through this pandemic is your safety and your health. And nothing can be or will be ever done to compromise that. The safety of people, of staff, of students will be the overarching priority in everything we do. And that does mean a blended model. That doesn't mean everybody cramming back to the college tomorrow. It will mean more online provision than perhaps we'd like in an ideal scenario. But it won't mean just online. Blended doesn't just mean online. It means online and on site, and doing it in a safe way. And a huge amount of work has been done in a very collaborative fashion to develop a detailed roadmap for a resilient return that will be safe. And I think it is about a resilient return. There's no point, having a return to on-site today to find out that very quickly you have to reverse engines. We need to build this up in a safe, gradual way, always grounded in public health. And I'm really pleased that the return to college roadmap that we've produced is endorsed by and worked upon by public health officials. So when I hear some commentary in relation to this, I want to be very, very, very clear. The return to college for staff and students is grounded in public health principles and the best information and knowledge we have about how we reduce the spread of this virus. I should say that it is an exciting and difficult moment for students starting college for the first time. We were presented with a very difficult situation in March of this year, nobody's fault, but this global pandemic meant it wasn't safe to carry out the Leaving Cert exam. And that meant we needed to put in place a whole new system to try and make sure there was a pathway to get students from secondary school and into third level. And again, it wasn't inevitable when COVID visited our shores that that would be achieved. And despite challenges along the way, the system that was put in place has meant now that this year, more people than ever before in the history of our state are taking up places in further and higher education. I think that's really exciting. Despite a global pandemic, more people than ever before are taking up places in further and higher education. We've already seen the round one offers of the CAO, where again, more offers than ever before, more acceptances than ever before, and the same percentage of people getting their top offers this year as last year, 80% of those getting an offer, getting one of their top 3 choices. This Wednesday, we'll see round 2, where I think we'll see the cascading effect of all the extra places we put in. So many people in round 1 will have got a level 8 offer and a level 6 or 7 offer. If they've accepted their level 8 offer, that now frees up that level 6 or 7 offer to go back into the system and be offered to another student. So I'm really looking forward to that cascading effect of many people on Wednesday of this week getting good news about opportunities and courses for them as well. And I really want to thank everybody for that. Having ensured that there is a way of entering higher education, the next pressing task and challenge now is to ensure that this can be as close an experience to that which they would anticipate and expect. There's no point engaging in any baloney or bluff. It will not be the same, but we need to get it as close as is safe to get it. And I think we have to acknowledge, as Pete has said, that this is a real challenge. People get so excited about going to college, Rag Week, Freshers Week, all the societies, mixing, mingling, meeting new people, all the things that in many ways we have to curtail as a result of COVID. But we need to challenge ourselves and challenge each other to make sure that the college experience this year, whilst different, is not inferior as well. And I really do thank the colleges for the leadership they've been providing in that regard. And it is important that they continue to remember that not everything can be done by Zoom, and the well-being of the student in the most rounded sense is really important as well. This is about a new normal. Obviously that requires me and government providing resources. I don't intend to go through all of them in the time available, but I think it's fair to say we have provided significant additional resources, €168 million, to help our colleges adapt, whether that's buying the hand sanitizer, buying the perspex, making sure the library is safe, and making sure that the signage on the ground is all right to get people in and out, acknowledging that they have to pay licensing fees for online technology. But also, we haven't just invested in buildings or institutions, because why do we have buildings and institutions? We have them for students. And we therefore have made sure that we have a package of supports in place for students. So I am very conscious that this pandemic has had a huge impact on all of our mental health and well-being. It's had an impact on mine. I'm sure it's had an impact on yours. It's impacted us all in different ways, but it's impacted us all nonetheless. That's why we're doubling the Student Assistance Fund, the fund that students go to when they fall on hard times. Maybe they couldn't get that part-time job that used to help them through college, and they now need some financial assistance. It's why we're putting €5 million more into mental health supports. And I think that's really important. I always hear from students that what is available in third level is good from a mental health point of view, but there's issues in getting in and accessing it quickly enough. So more counsellors, more psychologists, and we'll be tracking the delivery of that through the Higher Education Authority. I also want to say to everybody on this call, whether you're a student or a staff member or anybody, that we now have, for the very first time, put in place a 24/7 helpline, text line 50808, where at any time, day or night, you can text that number, and we need to make that number famous, 50808, if anybody has a mental health issue that they'd like to tease through or discuss with anyone. And of course, we have to recognize that we need to provide the technology to students who are online learning. So we're providing 17,000 more laptops as well. Look, I think our next challenge now is this week, and it must be this week, to finalize the outbreak protocol, because as Professor Nolan said, just like in any workplace, we will come across COVID cases. And it's important we don't panic. It's important we're consistent in our approach, and it's important that everything we do is grounded in public health advice. So we will work collaboratively with unions, with management, with students this week to ensure that can be put in place. Finally, I just want to say this. I have no intention that we spend the next number of months, pardon the pun, lecturing students about their behaviour. Young people have been excellent in relation to how they have helped play their part during this pandemic. And they've done so at a time where it's required significant sacrifice from them. So we need to work collaboratively with students, with student leaders, so people can resume their college life in a safe way. That will require incredible leadership from the student movement, which I'm happy to say we have in spades, and we will support and resource that. So we're entering a very important number of weeks, probably a tricky number of weeks, but it's about getting this right. Education is a priority. We have to be able to provide this in a safe manner whilst we continue to try and live alongside this virus. So I want to end by how I began, by saying thank you to each and every single one of you for all that you've done. And I really look forward to working with you, resourcing your work, and supporting you in any way that I possibly can.
Thank you, Minister. And I think it is timely to recognise and thank Professor Nolan on behalf of us all. The Minister put it very well, as did Professor Lunn. So a Gurmila Magwith to you, Professor Nolan. And Minister, I think that you're right, and the QQI report did highlight the high quality of teaching and learning, which is very positive. And I think we all appreciate the importance that was placed upon higher and further education as a priority. But that safety is always the first and foremost factor in terms of those decisions. And it is important to get as much of as close of a pre-COVID experience, I think, for students. And I think on behalf of the organisers and those of us on the call, I think to welcome the funding, it was very much essential and welcomed by the sector to help ensure that resilient return of which you referred to. So thank you very much to the Minister and to both Professor Nolan and Professor Lunn. I'll ask you now to turn back on your cameras because we have received a high volume of questions, so we'll get to them and try and get through as many of them as we possibly can. So I might start with a question for Professor Nolan. What conditions would you consider safe for students in face-to-face teaching in terms of minimum distance between students, the duration of classes, maybe the numbers and face coverings and so on was one of the questions that we received. So I might put that to Professor Nolan, but if anyone wishes to come in afterwards, please do.
So I'll keep it very brief. There's no easy answer to that question. One easy answer is that the guidance that came from the department is very comprehensive and to a very high standard. I think that's the first thing. So if that guidance is appropriately implemented. So there's no absolute rule. There will be laboratory sessions that might run for 2 to 3 hours. Most classes are going to run for considerably less than an hour. I think the way to think about it is, if a circumstance is not crowded, if hand sanitization is strictly observed, and if most students are wearing face coverings, it doesn't have to be universal. Even if 2/3 or 3/4 or 80% of the students in the class are wearing face coverings, that massively reduces the risk of transmission. And certainly I think staff and colleagues, there will be no circumstance under which I have to come within 2 meters of a student, other than if I'm assisting them in a laboratory setting, in which case I would expect both me and the student that I'm assisting to be wearing a face covering, and I'll be very careful about how I handle that. So I think we should move away, as Peter said, from absolute rules, more towards avoiding crowding, being really strict with our hand sanitization, and wearing a face covering where we do have any concerns that are a little bit too close.
Thanks very much. And I think the point around face coverings as well is something that we need to take into consideration from accessibility point of views and so on with students with disabilities. So I think that's a very fair point. Unless anybody else wants to come in on that question, I might move to our next one. Okay, so I'll move to Professor Lund on this. Just for your thoughts in terms of how to engage and deal with students who may prioritize work over college. If college is not face-to-face because it's online, people may view it in a different way. And so is there any hints on how we can show students that the education sector is still going, that lectures and so on are still taking place, and that it's really happening, and how to encourage engagement in that area?
Do you know, I saw that question come in, and Abismi was desperately hoping you weren't going to ask it to me. Part of the reason for that, to be honest, is, I mean, I have some young friends who are trying to decide whether to go to college or defer, and I think it's an incredibly difficult decision, actually. I mean, the labour market's not exactly in a state where it's easy as a young person to pick up casual labour and earn decent money. So I mean, it's not like the options at work are great at the moment. I think it's incredibly difficult and individual decision. So the idea that one can generalize and suggest it should go one way or the other, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want people to not go to college at all, but I think at the moment it's an extremely difficult decision for young people to make, and I would understand some of them wishing to defer and do something else if they can actually earn some money. So I don't want to suggest that they shouldn't, but I certainly think that the power in the question is partly about how we make sure that that college experience is real for people and we can get that across to them. One point I didn't make, because I didn't have the time, but now is an opportunity to make it, I think. We can do whatever we can do to make indoor environments and labs and lecture theatres and so on as safe as possible. But one of the things we know that the citizenry generally underestimates from our own work is the benefits of being outdoors. And I think the more colleges can encourage people to hold social events and congregations outside so that they get more of a social experience, but it's not indoors, the better. Most campuses I know actually have really nice outdoor spaces. They're one of the few places in the country where you're not troubled by traffic and busy streets, and there are nice outdoor spaces. The more we can cultivate those, cultivate norms of gathering in them, put furniture in them so that people use them, put signage in there so that people use them, put walkways in space that are really nice for students to socialise while going for a walk. There's an awful lot we can do to improve the college experience this year, even though we're putting in place all of these yellow signs and restrictions everywhere about how they've got to behave. And I think we need to be imaginative about how we do that so that people get a social experience of college as well as the educational experience, because the social experience you really can't get online the same.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think there's an awful lot of points to take out of that response in terms of the job market, but also that social element of college. I think the overall student experience is about more than the lecture and the lab work, although that is a very important element of it. Minister, I might move to you next in terms of this question, but again, if anybody wishes to come in, please let me know. But you referenced the importance of getting through the first semester, and so there's a question here around at what point in the conversation does on the return to campus do we move beyond looking solely at the first semester and look to providing clarity around semester 2?
So I suppose maybe I should have been a little bit clearer. I mean, we have the public health advice that is published, and obviously public health advice continues to be updated and evolved. But what I was a little bit concerned to see was, and this only happened on the odd occasion, when one or two institutions issued with great clarity and certainty that this was the way things were going to be for the next 12 months or 9 months. And I thought kind of fair play to them, but they must know an awful lot more about COVID than I do, and then we all do as a country, and then Professor Nolan does, because we're very much in the space of day to day, week to week, month to month. So I also, and I'm not the behavioral scientist, Pete, but I also, as a human being myself, I think it's better to try and think of things in time periods that we can get ourselves through. And whilst we know this virus is going to be with us for a significant period of time, I quite frankly think thinking September to December, getting to Christmas, it's a period of time I can get my head around and work and plan for. So to be clear to any staff or students, we do have the public health advice that we have in place is in place for the coming academic year. Obviously, if you get to a place where the prevalence of the virus gets much lower, obviously that opens up conversations about how you can do more on site. Obviously, in the roadmap, if heaven forbid we had to move to level 4, even worse, level 5, that obviously has consequences in the other direction. So the advice is the advice for the year. The roadmap is the roadmap for the next number of months. But I think we have to be agile enough. And then just very briefly, I think we all showed that on Friday when all of the institutions in Dublin responded very, very quickly to say, okay, we're still going to keep the colleges open, but how do we respond to protect the safety of our students? So I think agility is going to be key.
Yes, thanks so much, Minister. I think you're right. The agility is a very important element for the coming months, and hopefully we won't see the situation where we do enter into level 5, and hopefully we never have to have that conversation. Okay, I might move back to Professor Nolan. There's a question, there's multiple questions, so I should apologise. We're definitely not going to get to them all. But there is a question here that I'm going to pose to Professor Nolan. But again, if anybody wishes to come in, please let me know. What do you believe are the differences between the needs of first years as opposed to final year students, I suppose, in this year, and how can we address those?
I think that the differences in a way are obvious. Is the whole question of orientation. My first year in university feels like it was yesterday, and not only orienting yourself to all of this really interesting stuff you've been confronted with, you're orienting. I mean, I was orienting myself to be in a non-single sex environment, for instance. So there's a whole social orientation, there's a whole opening up, there's a whole academic orientation. So certainly our emphasis is that we've got limited time with students face to face in this semester, and we're focusing a lot of our energies on simply that orientation to the new style of learning, to the new environment they face themselves in. That's as important to us as, you know, biology 101 that I'll be teaching. So I think the students later on in their degree are not only oriented to the institution, this new mode of learning that we've been plunged into in the last couple of months, and how they're forming themselves as individuals in this newer and freer environment. Whereas first year, they're taking all of that on in one go. And again, I think it's back to us as an institution and our Students' Union supporting them through that. Just one passing thing that I should mention about integrity that I saw elsewhere. This is an opportunity for us to make our assessment instruments better and more creative than they traditionally have been. You know, a good assessment instrument isn't amenable to plagiarism, isn't amenable to downloading a stock answer off the web. So one of the things that this has provided is we're listening more intently to the expertise of people who really know about teaching and learning in universities than we might have when we were somewhat set in our ways in the past. So the disruption of this has caused us to focus our attention on better ways of teaching and better ways of assessing per force in this circumstance.
Thank you very much, Professor Nolan. And you actually took my next question there in terms of the integrity of higher education degrees. And I suppose, Minister, I was going to pose the question towards yourself. So I wonder if you have any additional contributions to make in that regard around ensuring the integrity of our degrees, and I suppose maybe some of the implications of moving towards more continuous assessment rather than our former exam style settings.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Philip had to say. Other than maybe just to add, I did meet with QQI and I did reference that QQI report already. And I think continual monitoring and public commentary by QQI during this time is very important in terms of reassuring all of us, but also very important in terms of protecting Ireland's reputation internationally in terms of the quality of the degrees and qualifications that people leave third level institutions with. I do think though, you know, COVID has been appallingly difficult for our country, but out of every crisis, you have to obviously try and find some degree of positivity. And I think maybe perhaps making the third level sector modernize a little bit and realize that there is going to be a direction of travel where learners are going to want to learn in a way that is more convenient for them. And actually the ability to open up learning to new cohorts of people, the model of being able to earn and learn as well, the use of technology. And we've probably come on in the space of 6 months more than we would have in 6 years, if not even longer. So there is that need, I think, to try and hold what is good. I often wonder, will the university of the future, it won't just be about the bricks and mortar, it'll be about the quality of the lecturers that you can attract. And maybe they'll be based far away from where you live, but you'll still be able to interact with them. So, you know, in the middle of the pandemic is not the time to dwell on this too much, but I think there will be some things that we'll want to keep from the use of technology as well. But QQI and their role overseeing and commenting and their independence, I think, is important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks again to all of our contribution, or all our panelists, for those insightful contributions and for fielding those questions. And apologies to everybody whose questions we're not going to get to. There are a significant amount of them, but I hope we've covered some of the most general themes that were coming through. I'd like to now move on to introduce you to Dr. Lynn Ramsey, who is the chair of the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning and a director of the Higher Education Authority. She holds a PhD in EU Law and Policy from the University of Glasgow, a Masters of Education in Leadership and Management from Trinity College Dublin, and has held academic and leadership positions in universities in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Her research focuses on higher education policy, professional development and student engagement, and she is currently the Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Letterkenny Institute of Technology and a Programme Manager for the West Northwest Higher Education Cluster. So if I can ask our panellists to turn our cameras back off and ask Lynn to turn her camera back, or to turn her camera on, and we look forward to your contributions, Lynn.
Thank you very much, Lorna, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I thoroughly enjoyed the fascinating discussion. It's really a pity to interrupt at this point, but I have been asked to offer some reflections, and it seems to me, listening to the speakers and to Lorna's chairing, there were 5 C's that sprung to mind: the need for calm, the need for courage, the strong collaboration across our sector, the importance of communication, and then the importance of wider community and leaving no student behind. So the calmness, I suppose, comes from the understanding that all the speakers shared that this year is going to be different and there'll be a level of uncertainty, and that requires us to respond flexibly and appropriately as and when things change. But at the heart of all this, we need to be courageous and ambitious for the sector. The Minister and Professor Nolan talked there at the end about the innovation that has taken place during this time of pandemic, new ways of assessing, new ways of engaging, new ways of working with the digital tools, new ways of working remotely with groups of students who might have found it difficult to engage. So there's a lot to remark on, a lot to be excited about in terms of this large scale innovation. We've learned a lot from what Lorna described as the emergency phase that we went through when we shifted very quickly to online. We knew that some staff were struggling, some students were struggling with the move to online, but they very quickly adapted with the support that had been given across the sector. We also knew there were barriers to people engaging, particularly around broadband, particularly around lack of equipment, and that collaboration that we saw across the sector has helped people respond appropriately. I'd like to commend in particular the laptop rental scheme that's working right across all of the higher education institutions and is targeting those most disadvantaged students and making sure they have the right equipment to engage appropriately and fully in higher education. We need to build on the investment that we've seen before. One of the reasons why the QQI report was able to talk about the stability and quality was that we saw sustained investment in teaching and learning since the creation of the National Forum. We have a really strong evidence base now about assessment. We have a really strong evidence base about transitions to higher education. We know that transitions is not necessarily smooth, and we know that this year will be particularly challenging for us, but we know that we're building on the evidence base and the collaboration right across the sector. So you see lots of good examples. For example, the Strategic Innovation Fund that was funded last year supports new innovations in teaching and learning in all of the funded HEIs, and they all have a digital element. The IUA's Digital Edge Future Learn programme is an incredible example of how we can support students in this new environment, working collaboratively. We're all recommending it. A similar project funded through the Innovation Transformation Fund would be the CUA INO project. Great examples of innovation and courage across the sector. The Irish example is being increasingly followed across other European countries, and we see an increasing number of countries interested in this National Forum model. The Erasmus-led the Dutch-led Erasmus Plus project, for example, is calling on a range of countries across Europe to adopt a national forum type model to support innovation and a focus on teaching and learning. And equally, the OECD National Group of Experts in Higher Education is looking to Ireland to understand our example of how we responded to the sharing of practice and collaboration in response to COVID-19. I think as we move through this semester, and the Minister there talked about the importance of thinking in clear timeframes, we must ensure that this collaboration, this partnership that we talked about, becomes meaningful in every way. We have to listen to our staff and listen to the students. As a forum, we now have a call for student associates, at least one for every higher education institution, and they'll be in place from the second week in October this year. This means that we can learn in real time what this experience of students is like, and that we can respond collectively to support that. So I think on that basis, I'll hand back to Lorna to thank everyone, to share the thanks to Professor Philip Nolan. He's remarkable in his generosity and his ability to share and work with us all, and we're all the better for it. But those 5 C's of calmness, courage, collaboration, clear communication, and that wider sense of community that no student is left behind, I think will be our watchwords as we move forward into what will be a difficult and demanding, but ultimately a very innovative and rewarding semester. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Lynn. I think you've summed up the challenges and the opportunities very well there. And I think those 5 C's will be important for us all to keep at the fore of our minds. And thanks for referencing the investment and the innovation in the digital environment. I think that has really supported us over the past and will continue to do so into the future. And of course, to the work of the National Forum, it has played such a vital role in supporting the sector, both staff and students, and I'm sure it will continue to do so long into the future. So thanks very much, Lynn. And on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for their contributions today, to Minister Harris, to Professor Lunn and Professor Nolan, and of course to Dr. Ramsey, and to thank each of you for joining us today. There was an awful lot of great questions that came through, and I hope we got to address as many of them as we possibly could. But thank you all for your time today, and Gurmila Magwiv, and take care.